Well, greetings from the team at Vendia, and welcome to Circles of Trust, a podcast for leaders across all industries committed to speeding up innovation at scale, making a profound and positive impact on business and the world. I'm your host, Tim Zonca, and we're about to dive into a conversation with longtime experts in the data space. Erin Kelly, Senior Vice President of Enterprise Solutions and Strategy at Kraft Analytics Group, and Francine Klein, Senior Solutions Architect at Vendia. In this episode, we'll talk about analytical and operational data, and Erin and Francine share some insights and dig into these two types of data and take a look at, are they on a collision course or not? And what does this mean for companies that rely on both types of data? All right, so let's jump into it. Erin, Francine, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. So excited.
So it's been a while since the two of you worked together at Slalom. So tell us a little bit about each of your backgrounds and what you're focused on now. Let's start with you, Erin.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my role at Kraft Analytics Group, affectionately named CAGR, a little bit of a play on compounded annual growth there, I lead all of our client-facing delivery for both a strategic consulting arm as well as a data and analytics platform perspective. So kind of live in the business tech data intersection on a day-to-day basis. And we service at CAGR, we're across all major professional sports leagues and industry players. So folks like NFL, NASCAR, Amazon, and others we've worked with in terms of how to utilize data to drive great fan experiences.
Great. Thanks. Francine, what about you?
Prior to joining Vendia, my career was in consulting, and I was actually on Erin's team in the data and analytics space, building out different data strategies and really understanding where companies were with their data vision. Then went and had done it myself at a company, and by doing so really knew the by dichotomy between the operational and analytics data. And so by stumbling upon Vendia and seeing that there's really a data fluidity problem and a data sharing problem, as well as this separation of these worlds, jumped over here to make it real for our customers. And so my role is to understand how customers are doing data sharing today and really using operational and analytics data and building better solutions built on Vendia with that.
You know, one of the things that I assume is really interesting if you're in your roles is that you're working with customers all the time. And so I assume that spans just a really broad spectrum of customer maturity around their dating sharing practices, where, some of them are really mature and doing impressive things, and others, they have a lot to do to catch up. The opportunity is large for them. I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the most common themes that you see or kind of trends that you see across kind of those areas of maturity, and depending on where they're on their journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll grab this. And so the sports and entertainment industry is pretty interesting. I think in many aspects from a data and analytics perspective, it's could be anywhere from 5 or 10 years behind some other industries like financial services, insurance, what have you there. But it's pretty exciting from both my experience prior to joining CAGR with Francine at Slalom and other pieces like that to really help the organizations kind of climb up that maturity curve and ladder. And so we focus a lot on many sports and entertainment organizations are what we would call data laggards. So really at that bottom of that maturity curve. And how do we actually get them over that initial chasm where organizations may have had an initial data platform, they have their operational systems in place, but they're not really connected and they're certainly not driving business value in those pieces there. And so as folks move up that kind of maturity curve there to more data pioneers, like one of the big things for us that we're talking about all the time is that strategic application of data. So great, you've got the technology, you've got the process, you've got the integration in place, but are you thinking about the right ways and the use cases and the right time to be able to activate appropriately and really drive the value? Because at the end of the day, if the business value is not being achieved, then the investment in that tech data stack really isn't going to get you where you need to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about you, Francine? Any trends that are particularly impactful that you see across that spectrum?
Yeah, and Erin made some really good points around the fact that people have this operational data for really targeted activities versus then using that for analytics and insights. And so how do you actually embed those insights into some of those workflows? And what's always really interesting is that the thing that's in those is it's all the same core entities, right? We're always talking about a fan or a customer or a product. And so the reason why these things become arduous is there's so many stops and starts in the capability of actually creating those data sets in the operational workflows, right? Create the new customer or create the product purchase versus the insights generated of that. But it's the same customer in those two things. And so how do it's the stops and starts that make sure that those two customer lists are actually the same. And that's some of the crux of the issue that we see and where those two worlds really should be colliding.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of my more favorite buzzwords that are out there right now is really this data mesh, data fabric. It's like the buzzwords of the years past was around the lake, the swamp, the lake house, everything water related. Now it's above the surface and more connected in terms of both fabric and mesh. And what does that really mean to be bringing analytical and operational data together to go do a action, deliver a great experience, drive a competitive advantage for an organization. And I think there's folks are starting to aspire to some of those more seamless moments, which I think we're going to unpack those today here in terms of what that could look like at the edge of analytical and operational. But again, it's balancing out between those laggers and trying to get them up to pioneer, so that we can even talk about the fashionista terms of mesh and fabric and everything else like that.
Well, to help us get there, I'd love to have the two of you dig into, you've both used the term operational and then analytical data. And so can you talk a little bit about, to you and your customers, what are those terms? What are the differences in those data types? And if you could provide some examples of each of what you see in each of your customer bases, I think that would be really useful for our listeners to get a good appreciation of those different terms, especially what they mean to you and your customers.
So operational data, think of it as the events, right? The actual thing that happens in the workflow, that you create the customer, right? You made the deal, you made the purchase. So for us, right, it's shopping online. We go and we click things, and so that information is operational. And in that, from a data perspective, from a technical perspective, you actually need all the information about me and all the information about a product, right? I pull the product, the price, comments, etc. And so from a data perspective, you can think of it's the full row for a single record. And translating that from an analytics perspective, you don't need all that information. You actually want to look at you want to sum up the calculations of price. You want to sum up the activity history for single columns, but across lots of rows of data. And so that's really the crux of it at a core level is, wide or long.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's layers on top of that.
You're spot on there, Francine. And I think one of my favorite statements around analytical data is it's used to make business decisions. It's very crisp and clear there, where at the operational level, it's transactional data, to your point. It's recording at point in time what is happening in that specific business process or workflow or other pieces like that. And that's kind of the beauty of getting them closer together in terms of how do you use the information around the trends and the aggregate that is used to make business decisions and deliver that to the edge where operational transactions and other pieces are both triggered out to a consumer, an operator, or whatever, and then also collected.
Is it fair in what you said to, before we jump into, I'd love to hear some examples of each.
Yeah,
You teased out one, Francine, but I'd love to hear some examples of each. But before we get there, is it fair, based on what you just said, to kind of assume that the decisions being made, let's say on the analytical side, you use some examples of there are people looking at stuff saying, hey, we're going to make business decisions here.
That's right.
Whereas are the decisions being made on the operational data side, because they're transactional, kind of more made by computers, like show dynamic pricing based on these mini decisions on the data while someone's looking at the merchandise or what have you? Is that a fair assessment?
That's a very good question. You actually picked up on something that where the analytics and operational worlds have started to merge a little bit, dynamic pricing. And so, yes, right, it's the workflow. Operations is that immediate workflow, transactions, a deal booking, an invoice payment, right, a credit card swipe. But dynamic pricing actually is the start of the operations and analytics world, and it is an example of the tip of the iceberg of what really can happen. And so for that to happen, right, you have to actually look at some trends. And so you have to do analytics off of trend history. And so for that to have occurred, someone some systems have to have taken tons of operational data, put that into a warehouse, looked at some trends, and then therefore from those insights embedded that into that operational workflow. And so one of the things that's just started is that spot capability. And so analytics is embedded real time in operational workflow, but those insights are probably likely delayed, right? It still is the massive amounts of stops and starts to get that information, generate those trends to then incorporate that. And that's, I think, what where Erin and I are hitting at is those stops and starts shouldn't happen, right? That can start going away with some more of these systems coming in place. And the reconciliation that needs to happen to make sure that you can incorporate those insights in the right place to the right customer is where the need for the data fluidity is, where you need that aligned customer, you need that aligned product. Otherwise, you have all this transformation and logic that's really complex.
But you're spot on, Tim, in terms of technology being the true enabler there. If you're feeding it with the right information and the right triggers and the right business rules and controls, then it really does become then a pretty great differentiator from an automated, efficient standpoint in terms of those true workflows that are hitting the operators, the customers, the products, the things that matter and are driving the business on a day-to-day basis. You know, one of the so from just some examples of analytics use cases. So we at Kager focus a lot on the fan experience, and to us, we think about the fan and kind of the overall fan funnel, whether that's acquisition, engagement, retention, or whatnot from that standpoint. And so, you know, some of like the interesting use cases that we're tackling on a day-to-day basis with many of our clients, you know, from an acquisition standpoint, it's really focused a lot on performance marketing or targeted campaigns. So is a team or a league talking to the right fan with the right product being ticket, retail, merch, engagement through the right channel? And how do we actually think about that on a day-to-day basis? And, you know, we have clients that have immediate tickets to sell for a game on Sunday. We also have clients that are sold out and are really focused on driving broader fan engagement. And so being able to use a combination of analytical data to understand and target and pull out those specific customers and then activate actions through any sort of digital channel. They're your more traditional of email, CRM, sales call center type pieces, but also, you know, lots more digital channels that are coming online, specifically in the sports and entertainment space. I think, you know, one of my more favorite examples that we're in the talks of right now is really around what happens in venue when fans come in. And so how can, by the scan of your ticket when you're entering the venue, that you get identified that personalized, beverage offers or fan sweepstakes or other pieces like that can go out to the right person at the right time and deliver an awesome fan experience. So, I mean, it's like you think about, how can you use data and analytical data and operations to drive memories? That's what we like to do on a day-to-day basis, and that's what we like to work with our clients on.
And that's really interesting. So with that, the type of information that you guys have to pull, right, is not just operational in nature, but it's also the speed at which you have to embed the accurate information based off of. If they've already done something, the analytics can't be delayed, and it also has to be incorporated probably quite real time, right? You don't want to get them the recommended beverage when the game is over.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah, you're hitting exactly. We're constantly building up behaviors, trends, understanding who do you look like? Does the Francine Klein going to prefer this hot dog or this hamburger or whatever? And even if you haven't purchased before, and I think it's really exciting in terms of the power of the data and the information and the partnership between analytical and operational to do that in a swift fashion. And that's where the super cool terms like data mesh fabric and all these other things that venues and operators are thinking about kind of come into play. And how can you actually create a more integrated ecosystem or business network, if you will, to connect all those pieces.
And actually pulling on that example even more, not to belabor this too much, but right, imagine you don't have information from the ops perspective and the analytics, but you keep recommending the same hot dog. Like, I'm full. Like, stop recommending that. I'm over it. Or we recommended it too late because the game is over.
You're not Joey Chestnut.
Right, exactly. Like, you got to update that stuff. Or like, the customer, right? I'm Francine in one system and I'm spelled the wrong way in another. How do you know that that's that same Francine, that something else about me because I bought a shirt, and therefore maybe I'm not going to eat a hot dog because that's going to get messy.
Yeah, 100%. One other thing that's really interesting, and I'm sure it's applicable to all businesses, but certainly in the sports space, and certainly coming out of the pandemic, is that the face of the sports fan has changed a lot, and so behaviors and trends and historical patterns that existed prior to the pandemic have really kind of gone out the window, and the new normal, or whatever we're calling it these days, has been established. And there's an interesting element that you have the operational data on what is the customer doing, or the lookalike customer doing, but what we're also pulling in is a lot of different macro trends around consumer behavior, consumer spending more broadly, lots of economic, social pieces there, and like, how can you continue to learn more, inform more, get to a better set of actions at that operational layer through not only the data that you can collect on a day-to-day basis, but the information that you can enrich just with the world around us, and really try to push the innovation forward, which is kind of what we love to do.
Yeah, I wanna touch on actually some of the data sources in just a moment. So thanks for bringing that up. Before we do, Francine, I want to get your take on some examples. But Aaron, I love that example just because, at least personally, I've kind of seen some of this at play. As my over the summer, I'm a Chicagoan, so like you grow up just loving baseball. I live out here in Portland, Oregon now, which doesn't have a baseball team, but my kids have fallen in love with the Seattle Mariners because I think they're an example of a group doing such kind of compelling work and just kind of continuing to bring us back and give a great experience. So that example really resonates with me. Francine, what about the kind of customers? I mean, you work with customers that do all sorts of stuff from auto manufacturers to pet healthcare providers. I mean, so the examples are like extremely varied. Any favorites that really, to you, the examples of like kind of data or use case that to you really highlight the some of the trends that you see happening in the market now?
Ooh, you're asking me to say a favorite of some of our customers, Tim?
I think more just like example, like you can leave out names or something, but
Yeah.
you see the kind of things that they're doing,
Yeah.
and it seems to span like a really broad breadth of kinds of customers. I think is what's seems fascinating.
Yeah. One of the ones I'm going to pull on is actually what I think might not be the most moving, but I think it's going to actually really simplify some of the things in which people might be pigeonholed in the wrong way. And it's someone who's trying to build basically a ID graph based off of all different information. And so think of it as like a real-time accurate no-fly list based off of information from anything you might do, from credit card processing to your credit history to other places like your mortgage payments and so forth. And so right now, right, your credit score is quite delayed, right? It not only is delayed, and it's really hard to argue with. And so say you want to oh my goodness, like refute something that's on your credit history report, you have to call this firm, you have to call 3 different firms because they each have a report about you, and who knows what kind of phone tree you're going to go through. And then you have to call each one of them. And if one of them has not updated it, right, they'll get the information from the other one and basically overwrite. And so you're basically stuck with this credit history that you might not agree with and say like, hold on, this is not right. This is inaccurate. Who knows what the reason is? And so they're trying to create this, it's kind of like this no-fly list, but it's not a no-fly list. It's everything, right? It's your credit history, it's your payment history, it's all of these things in one, and you have insight into it and can real time provide input to say like, this is accurate, this is not. I want to argue this, and it goes immediately to each of the different parties that are using this information to generate their own scoring mechanism. And I think that will really kind of open up the opportunity for folks to not feel basically pigeonholed and labeled in a way that they feel like they don't have a way to fight against.
Yeah, interesting. In both of your examples, you touch on just this idea of kind of data sprawl, and I think it seems to be such a given where like there's no future where the data is not in more places across more stuff and looks harder to access, harder to share. So I'd love to have the two of you touch on that. So what sorts of data like sources are common, kind of paint a picture of that, because it seems like anytime you hear an example, it's like even way more varied than someone like me would have originally guessed, and it seems like therein lies some of the snafu and complexity. So I'd love to hear about some of these sources and what makes it hard to share that.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll grab the ball first. So from what we see on a day to day basis. So with a lot of our clients, kind of the top three sources, and again, we focus a lot on understanding the fan and the fan behaviors and the fan engagement. So the big sources for us coming in are the transactional layers, which are most common. Ticketing is obviously up there in terms of how people are actually transacting and purchasing. Obviously, there's retail up there as well. The other pillar is that kind of more CRM, that traditional information around interactions and behaviors and calls and services and all that good stuff. And then the kind of that email marketing or whatever that engagement and touch point is. And that's where we start in terms of building up kind of that single view of a fan throughout a variety of touch points. And then it gets really fun. And then it gets fun in terms of what else are they doing in terms of both in an experience, but online. How are they interacting? What's the loyalty program? The other pieces like that. I think, as sports organizations are innovating pretty rapidly in terms of increasing the number of touch points they can have with said fan and eyeballs and all those other things that are happening there. And I think then we're talking a lot about even in that cookieless future, which is probably coming sooner than later. How can sports organizations and industry players just create that reach? So that could be anything from digital and how do you transition or how do you convert the unknown to the known and be able to figure out more patterns and behaviors from that standpoint. And then we focus a lot on kind of your more traditional demographic appends and additional information that we can pull in from a variety of places. But at the end of the day, we're living in the sports and entertainment space. And so it's really all around that ecosystem on how an organization is interacting with the fan, whether that's initial acquisition or all the way through purchase, and then retention and loyalty from that perspective.
Yeah, that's Erin, what you had pointed out in that example is the thing that I keep thinking of is if you're talking about this fan, right, and you obviously want to augment their experience with different information, like operation analytics and data sources that you've talked about. Whether that information is still about the fan, and so it's touch points with them when the marketing system, or touch points with them in calls, or touch points with them in things that they've purchased. Right? So there's like a financial system and marketing system, a support, support help system. There's still that fan that they're each disparate systems, and so they don't know that in system one I might be Francine at Gmail, and system two I'm Francine K. And one of these things from a data perspective that I just keep seeing no matter what is like getting back to basics of how do you actually know that this Francine is that Francine to actually create that unified vision.
Yeah, 100%. It's actually like, as you were talking about that, it always seems to come back to the basics. So as much as the technology has continued to evolve, if the guiding principles of the basics aren't there, then it's not going to be realized. And so it really does come back to an increased sophistication on it's one person. How do you connect all those informations? And when you do that right, that's when you can light up all the great, super great experiences. But it's that balance of complexity. Like the place where technology continues to move us is so exciting, but it's only as much as how much stitching and controls and other pieces that you can put in place to be able to capture that. We talk a lot about just kind of change management and data. Like I think that a lot of organizations have kind of nailed it on the head. And again, I've been in consulting for a long time prior to joining Kager, so I saw a lot of change management. I think, but when you think about change management from like an application or a process or even an org structure standpoint, I think organizations typically do that pretty well, or they understand what it's going to be like to move from a Dynamics to a Salesforce, or from an org structure one way to an org structure the other way. It's not easy, but there's like some blueprints there. I think change management around data and how you can move up the curve with data there, I think is like really complex. It's there's a lot of different muscles that folks almost don't realize. I think we talk a lot about when you're putting all that, stitching all that data together to be able to then actualize it, you're putting a huge spotlight on potentially a lot of upstream or other issues within the organization that need to be addressed in order to truly use your data as an asset, which I think is what we're all talking about here, is that data is the valuable asset that's going to drive the business or the process or the other pieces like that. And it is a different element around change management. And so Francine, I know we've been in multiple discussions back in slalom days around change management and all the importance there, but there's probably a few coffees or wines to be had there in terms of unpacking the solution to change management for data.
It's funny you were saying about like the back to basics and so forth. One, like you kind of hit something that I was thinking is, right, we can talk all the data side, right, operational analytics data coming together, and to your point, though, one of the things that we always say, well, can't you just do this? Can't you just get me information about the customer? And so no, we can't just, because there's complexities. And so the first layer is the data of ops and analytics coming together. But exactly what you said is the next layer is, even if you think data mesh, whether it's a tech system that's distributed or teams that are distributed, and that the whole concept of mesh is the autonomy, you can't give too much of that autonomy, because then you're just recreating that issue of the same data accuracy across each of those autonomous systems and or teams, and then their potential divergence of op processes that give you data that you can rely on.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it seems like, in that example of the mesh, the further you get into the mesh, the challenge if something happens is almost even could be potentially worse, that you're sharing
Mm-hmm.
more out there, that moment of, or the difference between doing it great and doing it not so great
Right.
is even smaller. So
You still need something that keeps the mesh within the web.
right.
Yeah.
I like this. We're going to pull this one.
Both of you touched on, especially you, Erin, you said something along the lines of, when you access data that, is within your organization, it seems like, part of the set of challenges is, you're accessing data, and in many cases it's within your organization. But it looks like increasingly that data isn't in your organization. And so it's not, access includes this notion of like permission, sharing, cleanliness. I can't go back and, like, to your point, Francine, be like, hey, I'm going to tell my partner over here to go clean up their stuff. So it seems like that's a whole other smattering of complications. I'd love to hear, what are the common problems you run into with customers as they want to, access data, but it's actually not theirs. It's coming from some other set of partners. Any kind of, gotchas and then practices that you see the best people doing as they walk through that set of problems.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's very common to not be a technical challenge that you're facing. You can build the patterns, you can understand those pieces, but it very much is around, like, I feel like there's a few things that we face a lot in terms of how are you defining and understanding the data? How are you going to be using that? What's the best way to bring that in? Because I think, and Francine and I can attest from years past, you can land data very, very quickly. What are you going to do with it? And how do you put enough kind of discussion about that up front without boiling the ocean, or going back to whatever water example that you want to have there? But again, understanding those pieces there, and then I do think that there's an element here of, like, looking around the corner. What should you be thinking about out a few years from now? How do you think about those pieces? Like, data privacy and preference centers and things like that are what we're talking about a lot in the sports space right now, in terms of where did a fan enter into someone's web of understanding? Is that at the vendor level? Is that within something that the organization ran itself? And then how can all those little privacy policies actually stitch together to a whole kind of governance and controls that need to happen there? But I guess, Tim, going back to, like, what's the secret sauce, or the first step, or the best practices there, I do think that I think there's a moment up front with the right kind of business leaders, business and tech leaders in place, that need to sit down and really talk about what's the overall intent, what's important now, how to understand the baseline understanding of the data, and get the right kind of initial privacy process governance pieces in place, and at least set a pattern. Like, we talk a lot about patterns. Like, you're never going to solve everything. Data is naturally always moving and is very imperfect. But what are the patterns that you're going to start to build with said vendor or other networks like that, so that there's a common understanding about the overall use case, the overall intent, and then again, that flows in terms of the foundation of the discussions that you can have.
It's really interesting because 100% they need that common definition. And so with that, right, everyone has a common definition of what is it that we want to share and how do we share it and what rules do we allow. And so while people want to like kind of come to the table, if there's some trust, right, they want to work together and do so, but there's not complete trust
Right.
in that network, right? They still each their own autonomous. And so the big issue in the space is how do you make sure that there's this like data network among these departments in which they still have full autonomy on their data, but they're all speaking the same language?
Yeah. It's a awesome challenge. I feel like there are moments each week, and you all may have this too as you meet with customers, that you have those ahas where, oh, this language is not the same, or we're not actually
Mm-hmm.
talking the same language, or you're
Right.
defining something as this. And how do you level the education that is out there around data in general, both within organizations and universities? Like, my, I know at the beginning we talked a little bit about ourselves, but I was a computer science geek in high school, computer engineering major, like kind of came up through those pieces. But, that was like a long time ago. So there's certain elements here that how do we broadly continue to raise the overall awareness? And, it's just really interesting. And I think I love some of the advancement that like technologies like blockchain and other pieces have like forced into the world. It's become a common vernacular around how to be securely, sharing information, the contracts that you need to put in place. But like, how do we actually take some of those as interesting buzzwords and actually layer them into this intersection of operational and analytical, especially when you're talking about outside of the organization, Tim, like you mentioned. It's not just about sharing internally, it's about sharing externally.
Well, I want to dig into something you just said, Erin, on like educating, the customers that we work with, and especially around kind of coming back to these two terms and ideas of the difference between operational and analytical data. I've been in the IT and the enterprise IT software space long enough that I remember the days of like OLAP and OLTP, which, were really like bifurcated, different markets and different sets of tooling to help people with their, OLTP, like the transactional, or as we're kind of talking, I hear you two use the words like operational data, and then the OLAP, like the OLAP, like the analytical. And, one of the things we've kind of touched on is like these two worlds seem to be colliding.
Yeah.
And so from an education perspective, the differences in analytical data versus operational, how much do those differences matter to the people that you're working with and educate? Um and how do you kind of walk them through, to the degree that there's a difference, like how much does it matter, and what do they need to know about those differences?
That's a really a good question because let's almost take our data hats off for a second. And if we're talking to anyone who wants to, right? How dare I? If we're talking to anyone who's not in data, like my entire family, and we say and talk about insights that you might want, and you say the word data, the thought of OLTP, OLA, I may as well be singing the alphabet, right?
Hmm.
Even saying operational, like what do you mean by that? And so even to have to say, well, you think of these things, they just think, hey, I want to do things and I want insights. It doesn't even matter that to deliver those insights, there might need to be a massive analytics infrastructure and data moving stops and starts between them. And so even if we as non-data people think about things, we think about them holistically. But the systems, because of, again, where we all came from and how you store data, they were very different and the access patterns were different and the development capabilities of teams were different. There's so many things that are reasons why they're separated. But if those technologies can start to collide, then the conversation and Erin, to use other buzzwords in blockchain, like the consensus among business networks can
Yep.
collide, right? And then the team skill sets developing on them. And so then basically the systems and the data stores, the people building on them, the business network collaboration can catch up with, almost not to the common person's dialect around, hey, I just think of data as all one thing.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think you've made some really good points there, Francine. Like one of what I had in my head right out of the gate when Tim asked that question of like, does it really matter at the base level between analytical and operational from a true education standpoint? Because yes, there are nuances within there, but when we think about, I think where the education is falling down, it's around the operations, the controls, the ways of working, the processing, the things that are around data in general, whether it's a aggregated number of 5% for a conversion rate, or a number of 1 for a whatever that might be from that data bit that's picked up from the CRM or something like that. I think at the end of the day, it's really around how do you understand like the data for what are you going to use it for? What is it? What should this be? What is it describing? Whether it's an analytical number, an operational number, and then what's important from the organization to both, keep, master, what's driving the underlying business model from a data standpoint, and then what are the key kind of security, infrastructure, process, governance controls that need to be put in place. And I think we're just like lacking so much education around those pieces, that it's almost like the analytical versus operational kind of doesn't matter right now, because there's so much around the process and the people side that needs to elevate. And then it gets real. I think if we could establish some of those just understandings at that level, just a respect for data as an asset and how that's looking, then I think you can get into some of the nuances too. So,
that's a really good point. Because do you remember when back in the Solon days when we'd sell and people would say, an example is conversion, or I want to look at my analytics of my pipeline velocity or something. And
Sure.
I would joke and say, absolutely, let's select all from this really cool table that doesn't exist.
Right.
The data does not exist. The process doesn't exist. You don't even have a CRM. So to your point, I'll understand these analytics and these insights, but the education of there's data and process and just commonality of what is this information that you want to collect and the process for the accuracy of that information, so that you can then answer these great questions and then make your process better.
100%. Yes. Whether that's a calculated metric or a collection of data at the edge or a trigger of information that is put there, but what's the overall kind of process and the workflow? I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And then when we kind of expand that, right, if that process is across different networks, right, and like vendors or ticket sellers or different data sources for credit history, that it's hard enough in the walls, imagine across the walls of just even that process and language. If you have a shared definition of what it is that you want to share, and just something that actually makes the data flow, and people have their autonomy, I mean, it just opens up the next set of questions that you have to answer, right, is obviously the business, the thing that makes it hard, right, the business relationships and so forth. But we could remove the tech side of it, then we can really focus on the value add of the business strategy.
Yeah, 100%. It's like remove the noise, common noise. Yep.
Yeah.
One of the perceptions I have that I'd love to either have the two you like debunk, or if you say, hey, no, I think there's something there, then kind of give your insights on, is that there's been a lot of fascinating things happening in the analytical data space over the course of the last few years. You see vendors like Snowflake and Databricks, or at least in kind of our tech circles, are household names, and it's a prowess in analytical data that many teams have really started to build. And as kind of, so like, I think the thing I'd love to have you kind of either debunk or say, hey, there may be something here, is it seems like there now will be the wave of that will kind of come alongside that, which is like, now there's going to be this explosion of operational data. And so you have all these analytical people in a great spot to be like, hey, we can now extend our practice to include these other sorts of things. So the first thing I'd love to hear is like, is there anything like, do you kind of buy that? It's kind of high level, impression. And then if so, what can those folks do to kind of prepare or to start to take advantage of like what should be a wonderful opportunity to do really cool things over the course of the next 5, 7, 10 years?
Yeah, I love this question, and I'm 100% with you in terms of in terms of the level of technology and innovation on the analytical side is so high. The almost like the funnel or the roadblock here, or whatever term you want to put in, is really like, how much can that actually get to the operational side in terms of both collection as well as activation. And I think it's an interesting area in terms of where businesses are investing. So if they're investing only in the strategy and analytics, the data tech space, but not in the sales, marketing, operations space, it feels like a huge missed opportunity, because the investment needs to kind of be made in both areas of, hey, we're elevating our ability to collect, identify, analyze, and activate data in a pretty rapid fashion. We need to have the business process, business applications, the sophistication within the functions itself to be able to actually take advantage of that. And I think, it's almost like the rising tide rises all boats. Like the boats all have to go together. You can't just have that from an innovation standpoint. Now, it puts more pressure, and I think in a fun and a good way, that keeps Francine and I on our toes in terms of how do you help the strategy analytics, that data tech analytical side of the business, actually articulate the benefits of the investment at the functions and the operational side. So how do you kind of paint that future state vision in terms of where the value of analytics can drive the overall business, and not just a business decision, but really a business action and an activation? And then what are the true investments that are needed on the operational side?
Yeah, Erin, you said it perfectly. If the visual of the rising tides, like with the data flowing and rising, right? That the business process that generates the data, the analytics that uses and tries to find trends in the data. And so, Tim, you're kind of hitting at, right, the analytics space has grown in its ability to churn through, right? It's made it really, really easy to go through the mass amounts of data that exist in ways that it couldn't before. And so before it was just slow, and you had to do a lot of different transformations, and you had to store it in different ways, and the different formats that data might come in were actually a way that slowed things down. And so analytics has made it to say, like, okay, well, data is going to be in different forms. Like, let's figure this out. We can kind of handle right? We can handle buckets and parse through data that's in buckets. We can handle data that's in tables and rows and whatnot, and go through it faster. But one of the issues that they had is the operational data was either slowing them down, to Erin's point, right? Because it wasn't accurate, or it wasn't really coordinated. And so, sure, you had this really powerful system that can turn through, but the sales and marketing and the finance data wasn't actually all the same information, or the data that you need from another company that you are trying to partner with isn't in your house or isn't even aligned, and you guys aren't speaking the same language. And so how do you get that in? And so the analytics world is trying to make a bridge to the operational world by creating connectors. Hey, it's going to be easy for you to get the data in. Great. Like, so then now that's where the data lakes came. It's like, look, we've made it really, really easy for you to send us all your operational data. But it missed the mark. And what Erin is hitting is, you really actually need the strategy that says, we're going to speak the same language, and we're going to actually share information across the ops and the analytics and our partners, so that the analytics actually has timely, accurate, connected data to then have insights and then have them back in the process.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing that you mentioned, Francine, is not only within the organization itself, but outside the organization. And so a lot of things that, a lot of pieces that we're thinking through with our clients is like data collaboration. How do you actually formulate the right relationships in terms of data movement, data fluidity between organizations, and what does that actually look like? And very often it comes down to really articulating business value. So what is the value of my data as an organization to you,
Right.
vendor, and what is the value of and what value can you, vendor, provide to us? And then how can we actually expand the pie together? And so, it comes back to that, like, overall business strategy and other pieces like that. And we talk a lot around give get, but again, it all starts to elevate into, okay, now the next piece is that those contracts need to be written in a different way to make sure that you have the right privacy and controls, but also the right measures to allow data flow in the right ways back and forth from organizations.
And so that's a really good point, because if they're sharing data, right, they don't sharing, like, you don't want to share it one way. You want it to be mutually beneficial. So if they're giving data, they also need to give the data information back. And so how do you make sure that back and forth bidirectional nature to it is there, with like, there's some trust, right? You have to have contracts in place, but there's, they don't want to share it with everyone in that net. Like, so you need agreement of who sees what, alignment there, and agreement of how you're going to use that. Like, if they're going to use it again, they've created a network and an agreement of how you're going to use this data for an aligned mission. You have to make sure that they do so.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what I was just thinking through, Francine, is like, who's job within an organization is that. Like,
Right.
I think very often it happens right now in isolated or of silos
Hmm.
based off of the business use case or the need. But, you know, is that the next wave of, and I'm sure there's some, really cool, innovative chief data officers and other pieces like that are
Yep.
stitching it all together. But it's like, it's a marathon, not a journey, not a sprint, I guess, in terms of getting those pieces. And, are the right people actually coming together to make like an informed
Right.
decision for today, but also for tomorrow, and thinking
Right.
around the corner.
Because people are sending data to and for, but if the businesses aren't strategically coming together, it's almost like we need a data UN across each different group to say, like,
Mm.
how do we collaborate together
Right.
on this mission by sending data to and from, but on the insights that we're going to generate and the experiences that we're going to do, and how do we hold ourselves accountable, right? So we don't do bad, or that there's not one bad actor who's using
Right.
the data, for harm or against the mission that they're doing so together.
Yeah, I hear in both of what you say. You touched on like how the operational and analytical data on the tech side are coming together. Erin, I love how you highlight like, hey, whose job is this? So there's it's evident that it's still early days of like the coupling of these sorts of two different data types. So assuming that there's more fluidity across those two boundaries, or those boundaries over time, what sorts of doors do you think it will open for organizations?
I
Lots
think,
of them.
yeah, yeah.
Go ahead, Francine.
I don't know. Like one thing that comes to mind when the ops and analytics start colliding is the obvious, right? Like the obvious in terms of the stops and starts, the delays, the layers of infrastructure that people are not focusing on the business value because they're focusing on just moving data to and from these systems and reconciling. So like some of the obvious ones that we've all seen in terms of like total cost of ownership.
Mhm.
How do we focus on the insights? But now, like what are those insights that people can start focusing on, and when we've now removed that technical and team layers, right, the different types of teams and processes and so forth, it almost feels like data becomes more of a natural dialogue. And so it becomes, we can talk about data in the way that we think about anything else. Like we think about the fluidity of like we can talk about data in the way that non-data people might think of it, as it's all just information. And so we can then start really thinking about experiences that feel more human, as opposed to, well, like, hold on, I have my sales process and then I have my analytics over here, but it looks at sales process. And so we'll just almost, I think, feel more human.
Yeah, so it's like, I guess as you're explaining that, I'm thinking like it's adding, like it's contextualizing the insights, it's adding the information, it's adding the other, pieces that are required to take again that 5% conversion. Is that good? Is that bad? What are the levers that I can pull to actually drive that activation or increase in that? And then what is that impact going to look like
Hmm.
down the line, and kind of raising the overall, I like the vernacular or the common language, you know, from like a broader like business model, business architecture standpoint, like thinking about like customers, products and services, operation strategy, for us, like, customers, like deeper understanding, deeper engagement, the relationships they can build, the getting the right product at the right time to the right customer, and doing that in a way that seems authentic, to whatever that mission is for the organization. From a products and services standpoint, like being able to make more nimble decisions on like what product is right, what service is right, when is when does the cost per acquisition for a particular product just like out outsized, and you need to move on, and helping to inform some of those decisions, and not feeling like, this is a finger pointing game, but this is a data informed information of how you're going to actually translate that into the business side. And I think operation stuff, really speaks to itself in terms of efficiencies and other pieces like that, where you can, start to really move the dial and move the levers, in terms of bringing the worlds together. But yeah, I think it's pretty exciting. And I think, just thinking about the world as even a consumer or outside of an organization, so not necessarily as a consultant or a service provider or product, but as a consumer, like that just, I see the future of it just feeling better. It feeling like more authentic, less hassle, less noise. That I don't need to give you so much more about myself, but the organization's actually doing a better job of connecting it so that it is a less hassle. And there's enough noise in the world. Let's use data to actually calm some of that so that the real things can take place.
And it's funny because, obviously, Erin, we've solved the art of the possible, especially, both in our current roles and at Slalom, but also like I can't help but think about back, fingers to keyboard. I came in the coding world, and so these art of the possible really, really like awesome things that I think are going to open up. And one of the things we kind of talked about back to basics that I don't think will ever go away is this 101. We've got to describe the entities, like what is the customer, what is the product, what is an employee, and once we get these, like, I guess nouns was the entities in the non-data world. Once we define these nouns appropriately and a common language across everyone of what this noun is, then all the other things that come off of the noun, all the verbs and events and activities can come through. And so I can't help but always go back to basics of like, we've just got to have the same definition of the noun.
Francine, you mentioned just the notion of like the art of the possible. And so in kind of the final questions we start to wrap up is, as it relates to the art of the possible, if each of you could get anything you wanted in the next, let's keep the time frame kind of short, 6 to 12 months or so, that would help unlock something in this data sharing space as you work with customers, what would it be?
I think I kind of hit on it, but I think that there's this concept, and I don't know the right word, and I know that someone much better at branding is going to come up with a much better word, but this like data UN, where these people come together and figure out, right? We know that data between the walls of a company is hard, right? And by 100%, each company struggles with it, and it's something that there's a ton of tools and processes and procedures to do so and approaches. And we'll continue trying to solve that as people fix their processes and evolve them over time. But I think the next thing, right, as we keep doing that, we're going to always have to put away our laundry, right? Our laundry is always going to be there and going to be continuous. But I think the next thing is this data across companies and this concept of this like UN, where companies have to kind of work together for a shared goal, but some guidelines that kind of keep them in line to do so.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard the term like data alliance from some folks kind of popping around. That sounds really similar to kind of this vision you have.
Yeah, that's a better word.
Erin, what were you?
Yeah, I was gonna build on a little bit what Francine was saying, and then I'll answer the question. But the build on is like, historically, like when we think about setting up data organizations, there's traditionally a few different models. There's not an infinite amount of models. It's a centralized model, it's a decentralized model, and then it's a hybrid model. And typically when we enter organizations, it's or back in the days of Slalom, it's super decentralized. Everything is running all over the place, wild, wild west. Sometimes there's that gut feel of, okay, centralize first and then control, but the control is never giving the right information out at the right time to everybody, especially as the organization matures. And it's like, and to your point around that data UN or that data alliance, it's like, what is the new hybrid model between businesses and process and vendor management and all those pieces that is like the best practice, the blueprint of how organizations should be thinking about data on a day-by-day basis? And it's like, history can show and teach us a lot around how some of these pretty complex situations might be able to actually have some patterns that are there. Now, not saying it's easy, but it's just an interesting piece to pull on. And, I think from just to answer the question in terms of, the next 6 to 12 months and how to unlock and make it maybe more bulletproof and less scary for organizations and open that up. I think I've got to double down on like the security, the governance, the control, like those pieces there. I think especially in the sports space, there's a lot of talk around data security, data privacy, and other pieces like that. Like, to me, like 100%, those are absolutely forefront, both for Kager, but for the industry. We got to be able to break that down though into bite-sized chunks that can be configured, controlled, other pieces, like beyond just the don't send anything. It's how do we actually send this in the right way? What are the right governance and controls that need to be in place? And I guess it's kind of tangentially related to that data UN. What are the right blueprints? What's the, there's a lot of pieces out there in terms of either legal policies or other pieces like that. No one has really stepped in and solved, like, here's like a couple ways that this thing can actually happen. And I think there are some organizations that I'm sure are doing it better than others. Like, how can we actually learn and establish those pieces? And again, that it dovetails back to what we were talking on the education. Like the more information and the more impact and use cases that we can have around this whole process controls perspective would be like so fantastic, I think, for all organizations, and particularly in the sports space, and really making sure that they're protecting, all assets and from a data perspective.
We need a model alliance to start practicing it with the youth.
Well, it's like the modern day debate club or
Yes.
whatnot. It's like we should be injecting that, Francine. Like what's the
Yes.
next data governance, the data sharing perspective. I mean, hey, there's probably some really cool ideas down there in the youth of
Right.
whatever apps are being used. I'm certainly not cool to be using all of them, though I am a technology lover, but I'm sure there's some really interesting insights that some creative minds could put together on how to solve this problem.
And they don't have the weight of the systems and processes and nomenclature. They could just think, well, why would I have to wait? And so
Right.
there could be something really cool there.
Next podcast, Tim.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to you both. I appreciate not only your time, but just you both sharing your expertise with our listeners. So thanks to both you, Erin Kelly, Francine Klein, for all the real talk on real-time data sharing. I appreciate it. Thanks so much to our guests, Erin and Francine, for all the real talk on real-time data sharing. And thank you too for listening in. If you're interested in learning more about the various organizations, products, or research mentioned in any of our episodes, visit vendia.com/podcast for all the links. When you're ready to keep the conversation going, download or stream all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple Music, and any of the top streaming services. If you have a point of view on the challenges, power, and potential of real-time data sharing and you want to be a guest on Circles of Trust, DM us at VendiaHQ on Twitter and mention Circles of Trust. Thanks again for joining us. If you like what you hear, take a moment, drop us a few stars and a favorable review, or share Circles of Trust with your colleagues and network. Until next time.